Now you know I have that devilish look on my face because I have I have been doing an awful lot of reading. Some of you who are like me and you like the history of the church, you also have to like Martin Luther's Table Talks. So let me start by saying that there were multiple different people taking notes or recording these conversations. I'll read you a little bit of the introduction here. So in addition to Luther and his wife and his 6 children who were born to them, the Black Cloister was for years the home of a maiden aunt of Catherine, that's Luther's wife, and several orphan nephews and nieces of the reformer. Several poor students roomed and boarded there too, in return for their clerical and other services. There was a constant flow of guests from near or far, and a few servants completed the number. In Luther's household, the day began at sunrise. The principal meal of the day was eaten about 10 o'clock in the morning. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon, supper was served, and this meal was often shared by exiled clergymen, escaped nuns, what a group, government officials, visitors from abroad, colleagues of Luther in the university who frequently stopped in, men like Melanchthon, John Bugenhagen, or Justus Jonas. The relaxed atmosphere of the hospitable home was conducive to spirited conversations, and so some of these would get, as I said, recorded in their different periods. So, sometimes Luther would sit down and they'd be eating and no one would say a word. And no one dared to speak then. And other times, just kind of like what we would do today. Luther would be sitting and he'd look at somebody and say, "So what's new?" Don't think that's colloquial. That's essentially what would be said. What's new? Somebody had to start talking. And in some of these, he just started talking, and sometimes the conversation was jovial, and other times it sounded like this. So here's a very brief record. Between November 30th and December 14th, 1531, this is recorded as number 131, and the label on this is the duplicity of Erasmus. And this is the way it starts. Erasmus is an eel. I love it. Nobody can grasp him except Christ alone. He is a double-dealing man. Now, if you're not familiar with the controversies that went on, and really about Erasmus's work, but some of it made a great contribution, but at some point I'll probably unfold a little bit of, it's like peeling back things. You have to dig deep enough to see it wasn't just Erasmus's humanistic mindset. There were other things. There were a lot of other things. But he calls him a double-dealing man. When Elector Frederick asked him in Cologne why Luther was condemned, what wrong he had done, Erasmus replied, "He has done much wrong who attacks the monks in their bellies and the Pope in his crown." Frederick said to another colleague, "He's a strange fellow. One does not know what to make of him." He at once recognized the man's cunning. It was the remarkable astuteness of Satan that captivated the world when he attacked the superstitions of the Pope. Then he corrupted the youth and the wicked opinions he expressed. Now, it's kind of interesting. You've got all these, and they're just small little tidbits into how Luther saw the world. So you can read Luther's commentaries. You can study historically, the culture and the world he was born into, very superstitious, very dark. And then you read these to kind of fill in the blanks. And there's a lot of stuff in here that just makes you go, wow. Now there is definitely, there's a couple in here that I know Dr. Scott liked because he underlined them many times. This is one of those that he underlined. Opinions about some of the church fathers. Summer or fall of 1531, number 51. Jerome was neither a theologian nor an orator, but was like the Swabian Altstag. In his controversy with the Pelagians, Augustine became a strong and faithful defender of grace. Gregory was leprous when it came to ceremonies. He considered it a mortal sin to break wind. That's what Dr. Scott underlined, by the way. I didn't underline this, he did. Ambrose was a straightforward defender of faith against a reliance on works. If he had been involved in controversy, he would perhaps have excelled all others. So there's all these little interesting things, and that's how you, somebody said, well, how do you fill in the blanks when, you know, you're putting together some of these things that you like to talk about? You kind of read through these and it gives you insight. That's how I filled in a lot of blanks for what I didn't know about his wife. Some of it's recorded in these talks, but they're not, they are in these, what I call ping pong conversations that weren't aimed at her, but she became the target of some of these. So it's quite interesting. I just kind of combed through the different, there's another one in here that's kind of, you know, he talks about if a priest should, or a man should be with a woman, and I'm trying to find, this is early on here. It's a very short passage in here. Luther talks about how he didn't look at the women when they came to confession. There's all kinds of interesting things you learn about Luther as well when you read this, things that he would not be preoccupied with. Here's another one Dr. Scott underlined: Luther drinks to God's honor. You gotta love that. But I gotta find this one. It's here. So this is in November 30th, 1531, the Friar Martin Luther and Sex, number 121. He says, when I was a monk, I did not feel much desire. I had nocturnal pollutions in response to the bodily necessity. But that's, who would translate that like that? I need to read this again because it's almost mind-boggling that something that deep could be said in such a politically correct way. I had nocturnal pollutions in response to bodily necessity. I didn't even look at the women when they made their confession, for I didn't wish to recognize the faces of those whose confessions I heard. In Erfurt, I heard the confessions of no woman, in Wittenberg of only 3 women. So it's kind of interesting how the mindset, but I'm kind of trying to build a little bit of a profile for you, for some of you who are interested, on some of what I call the peripheral people that actually are not so peripheral. They made larger contributions than we actually think into the thought and ultimately some of the theology that Luther then goes on to produce in his commentaries. And there's an interesting work that actually was produced probably about the same time as these are being quoted, in the 30s, 1532, 33. And one of these is, it's a work called Loci Communis, which essentially was Melanchthon's kind of recounting of Luther's thought through Melanchthon's eyes. And it's kind of interesting because you see there's this parallel as things are being brought forth, and then if you read close enough and you're familiar with Luther's work, you see where this kind of just swings off into a different direction, very much away from where Luther was. So there's all these interesting tidbits that you can glean out of this, and I think the most important thing is a conversation I had with somebody earlier today over, believe it or not, over this reformer Martin Luther. As the question was asked to me, is this relevant information that people would want to know? And I said, absolutely, because what it does is, for people who are not familiar with history, it gives you insight into history. It gives us an understanding, the word Protestant, in fact, what were we protesting, how we became Protestants. And if you're still going to sit on the Catholic fence about things, and that's what you believe in, that's perfectly fine, but don't be ignorant as to what was going on in the Catholic Church through history, which now the Protestant Church is frankly no different in its going astray and losing its way, but just don't be ignorant. So studying these things colors in history, understanding. It gives us insight into a person who I think was grossly misunderstood when many people chronicled Luther's life, even modern historians. Be careful about what books you buy when you're buying books and you'd like to read up on something that I'm talking about Luther. Be careful about what books you buy, because you'll find that there are some writers who were right from a Catholic perspective, and they're coming at it. Think of it like First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, the North and the South, just the way we understand that, the perspectives. Think of it as a Catholic writing about the Protestant Reformation, and certainly the German reformers from a Catholic vantage point. Even though they may acknowledge other things that were being done in the church as wrong, Martin Luther will still be painted in a certain light, different from someone who's looking at it from a Protestant realm and somebody who's just looking at it from a historical perspective with there's no interest one way or another. So you have to be careful about what you read, even when you're reading about historical personages, which you'd be surprised. Some people get their facts wrong. Even I was reading somebody's work on Luther. I think I referenced this yesterday about how they smuggled the nuns out of the convent, and they smuggled them out, including Martin Luther's not yet wife. She was one of those nuns they smuggled out. And some records have the nuns, for example, being smuggled out in a fish truck, and others have them being smuggled out in barrels, like barrels that they'd put hooch in. So is that going to make or break your day? No, but it's those little details. It's the same controversy I've told you about when you're reading. Some people will say Martin Luther's patron saint was Saint Anne, but those people who are giving you the history of when he was in the storm and the falling to the ground and crying out to Anne, to Saint Anne, Martin Luther was named after Saint Martin. So that is indeed the saint that he was named after. That was the culture and what he was born into. You named your children after saints. So he was named after Saint Martin. Anne being the patron saint of the minors. She provided, of course, in Catholicism, every saint has a specific function. She provided protection for the minors. But it is widely believed, if you understand the culture and the day that Martin Luther lived in, it's widely believed that when he cried out to Saint Anne or Saint Anna, he wasn't crying out to the patron saint of the minors. He was not a minor. But culturally, Jesus was viewed as too holy and seen as an unfair judge. So they petitioned then to Mary. Mary could intercede on the behalf of those believers because Jesus was too holy and he meted out judgment. But then they decided they wouldn't pray to Mary because she was too holy. So they prayed to her mother, Anna. So in that day and in that culture, there was great superstition that one ought to not pray directly to Jesus and one ought not even to pray directly to Mary. So depending on whose history you're reading and who chronicles, when you go back, if you have books on your own of Luther, you might get an indication of just these small details as you read them. Somebody will chronicle that he cried out to St. Anne because that was his patron saint. And some will chronicle that he cried out to Anne or Anna because that was the superstition of the day and how people actually, most and many prayers were offered to Mary's mother and not even directly to Mary. That was how people were pushed back. You know, it's not enough to just keep pushing it back, too holy, keep going backwards, whatever that means. So be careful about what you read. That brings up the next question. I'm sure somebody will ask, can I recommend some books? And the answer is yes, and I will eventually probably recommend that Dolores Press carry some books that I recommend, which I think are done, they're presented in a fine way. Some of them are staples that have been around in print for a long time, and others are kind of newcomers on the block, but the work that went into them and the research that went into them is probably a great testimony to the body of work that you read it, you know, the person's done their work. This is not somebody filling in the blanks because they want to paint Martin Luther or his family or his friends a certain way. So the answer is yes, I will actually in the future do that, and hopefully eventually we'll make them available through Dolores Press. But I don't know if these things interest you, but they greatly interest me. Some of the things that are sidebars are even interesting, just to hear how Martin Luther might have just talked in a day-to-day, around-the-table way, which really, I'm going to make up a word, it undeifies him. Maybe that is a word. You know, we have certain ideas about a person. This just brings it down to homey and real. That he'd sit at that table, that people would take down notes, and that he said this thing, Erasmus is an eel. Or, you know, there's other things that he says that are just, they're remarkable because they're just, that is so real and probably very honest. So, I don't know if you're interested in these things, but they interest me. I hope they interest you. And I kind of feel like I might just sit down here a little bit at a time and whittle away at some of these, just in between, to keep it real, because there's some real things in here. I'm not even sure I would even say some of these things, but Martin Luther said them, so if he said it, I guess I can get away with it, right? But let me know if you like this. I don't know if it's interesting to you. It's interesting to me. Now, I need you to get on the telephone, make your reservations, your commitments, and all those folks that called in messages saying, I'm sorry, I've been, whatever you were sorry about. I just want you to get back on the right page. We've got a lot of work to do, a lot ahead of us, a lot of good ahead of us. It's not all gloom and despair. There's a lot of good around the corner because God's hand is in it and on it. That means that whatever he does perfectly in his time and in his way. So I'm asking you to do your part, which is very little comparison. Reservations and commitments. Come on, get busy. Come into this house, magnify the Lord, lift up holy hands, our hearts in one accord, worship and bow down.